gosh, that was really good. So I'm going to read an essay today. I decided, like, at the last minute to change. And the reason that I changed is because my father died last year, and we are selling his house. And we're supposed to close tomorrow. So he lived in that house a couple of decades. There are a lot of feelings associated with that. And I've been thinking about this essay that came out last year that's called Palimpsests. It was not always called that, but that's what the editor wanted to call it. So that is its name now. And I've shortened it for time, and it was never the most tightly organized essay. So, so please forgive a couple of rough transitions here. Palimpsests. In 1990, Jacob Mason, not his real name, stopped playing video games. I was in middle school. I knew something had happened to him. I was still more than a decade away from any real kind of empathy. I was more interested in myself, as middle schoolers are. Jacob lived down the street. His mother was a friend of my mother's. He and I didn't know each other well. Something had happened, and he no longer wanted to play. I took his Nintendo console and his games, including the original Mario and the original Zelda, and I was happy to have them. That same spring in Leisure Woods in Buda, Texas, my neighborhood, there was a murder-suicide. A man had killed his wife and his children and then turned the gun on himself. No suicide note was found, though the murder weapon, a .38 caliber revolver, was found next to the father, Peter Yost. The lack of a suicide note was suspicious, as was the fact that none of the victims had been shot in the head, as would normally be the case, as was expected. People live in that house now, a nice-ish ranch-style home on Kildare Drive, and I think about how strange it would be to live in a house where 4 people died one night. But again, at the time, this crime was nothing more than a story to me. I was busy with my own life, new to the area, having a hard time adjusting. To say my home life was hard would be an understatement, but that is a story for a different time. Let's just say that my life revolved around 17 magazine as I tried to figure out how and what and who to be. Fantasy novels with larger-than-life heroines, hiding whenever my stepfather's car pulled into the driveway. I played Mario first, starting at the beginning and continuing all the way through, and didn't touch Zelda for a couple of months. But the rumors started, and they eventually reached me, even in my exile from the rest of the small town, because everybody whispered them. Peter Yost, who worked for the Texas Gambling Commission, had uncovered something, had been investigating something big. He never would have killed his family. And then 2020 came to film, and they did a whole story about how this was not a triple murder-suicide, but instead a quadruple murder. Yost had been investigating the Houston Turf Club, which at the time had a $1 billion lawsuit against the Texas Gambling Commission. The Hays County Sheriff at the time, Paul Hastings, said the questions raised by the Yost family and their representatives were beating the same dead horse. He said he was convinced that the murder-suicide ruling would stand for 1,000 years. Later, in an interview in July of that year, Hastings said that the day the shootings were thought to have occurred, Peter Yost suddenly canceled plans for one of his son Eric's friends to spend the night. Hastings did not identify the boy or his family. I don't remember where we got that information, Hastings said, and that was that. The world moves on. Everything I've ever written has been about how the past lies over the present but refuses to lie there quietly. I've been obsessed by the idea of palimpsests, which occurs when something is erased and printed over. Palimpsests occur when the raw material for the thing is worth more than the thing itself. I remember several years ago seeing a Da Vinci painting in one of the Smithsonian's. It had been placed into its own little wall, a window cut all the way through so that you could circle the painting and see what was on the back. On the front was a portrait that I thought looked quite similar to the Mona Lisa, a woman with a familiar expression and hairstyle. I walked around to the back and there was another painting. Even more interesting was the fact that historians had x-rayed the painting and found drawings made by Da Vinci before he had covered the canvas with gesso. Once I knew about these drawings, I thought I could see them through the oils on the canvas that formed other images. Just because something's underneath doesn't mean that it will stay hidden. One afternoon, near the end of the next school year, I finished Mario. I made it to the castle. It took me 3 times to rescue the princess. I thought about starting the game again, but instead I put it down and never picked it up again. I never did put Jacob's former Mario game back into his former console, but that was okay because I still had Zelda. My stepfather wasn't home that day, which was happening more often then than it had in Virginia, where we lived before. It was a relief to be in the living room on a Saturday, to be out in the open like that. I put in Zelda and waited for the game to boot. When I cycled through the options, there was a high scoreboard, a black screen with block white letters. And I'll never forget this, not for the rest of my life, that dead kid's name on my television. Eric Yost, it said. I sat back on the couch and I thought about what was leaving that house and about what I had just brought in. Your obsessions, a teacher once told me, are really only visible in hindsight. It took me years to recognize my obsession with palimpsests. Everything was once something else, and that past thing, whatever it is always present. At my high school, for example, the road that ran in front of it, a road we called FM 1626, or sometimes the old San Antonio Road, a road I found out later is older than the United States, was built by the King of Spain more than 300 years ago, El Camino Real, the Royal Highway, part of a network of roads in eastern and central Texas, built on roads that had been in use for a millennium. And at the corner of Interstate 35 and Onion Creek Road, where an Adams extract factory once sat, all mid-century modern and sleek, bulldozed one summer, it remained a pile of rubble for nearly 2 decades afterward. The slow rise of apartment buildings on the site, the neon lights of a gas station, but still underneath the imagined scent of vanilla extract, of almonds, of lemons, underneath the gray suits and thin ties of the men who had worked at the factory, the bouffants and heels and stockings of the women. Layers there, time on time on time, and all that time bleeding through the sterile present. This whole place a palimpsest and all the other places too. So you can probably guess which child was expected at the Yost house that night. All the pieces are there. I frame them in such a way that there are no extraneous bits that might serve as distraction, as real life would have provided us. I still see Jacob's mother and father occasionally, and my parents are close to them now. They've gone on cruises together. I've had Thanksgiving dinner at their house. But I've never asked them about that night, about what Jacob had seen or not seen, about how narrowly he may or may not have escaped something unthinkable. My mom has told me stories, but I don't know whether she ever asked or if they told her voluntarily or if things just come up over a friendship of a couple of decades. Jacob was there in that house on Killdeer Drive. He'd spent the night before. He was going to spend the night again, but something happened, and Mr. Yost sent him home. He left the house, according to my mother, about an hour before the sheriff said the murders occurred. My television, those white letters on a black screen, that was a palimpsest. Eric Yost, a dead child, in my house every time I turned on Zelda. I could erase his name, but that wouldn't erase the fact that this was a game a child who had been murdered had once played. What came before leached into the present. 2 parts to the palimpsest, the erasure of the old thing and the addition of the new thing. Recently, a writer came to speak at my university. He was a child when his family lived through Pinochet's Chile. Now he writes about the disappearances on our own southern border. So many people there but now gone. Tales, he said, of bodies being dumped from helicopters into the sea. Now people being taken by the desert, by police, by the middlemen known as coyotes. The 40 students who disappeared, just a drop in the bucket. This writer claimed that the word disappearance was a misnomer, that the people who were gone had not disappeared. Rather, he said, when a body goes missing, there's a hyper appearance, a conspicuous sort of absence, the kind a person can never ignore, a constant reminder of what's been lost, the never-ending questions. Where now? With whom? In pain? At peace? Things and people don't disappear, not until all the things and people they belong to disappear too. And even then, traces left in our universe and in every universe that comes after. I think of survivors in terms of half-lives. I was very young when my grandfather, my father's father, died. His sons tell his stories, and they tell them to me, his granddaughter. His sons know only part of his experience, and I know even less than that. I tell his stories to my children, and they, I hope, will tell their children too. But there's multiplicity as well, and not just a vision. My grandfather's stories involve other people I will never know. He was a sharecropper in Tennessee, tied to the land because he was paid in scrip instead of money. Money was rare in those days, coming only from the Works Progress Administration, only when they needed extra hands. There's a story from this time that my grandfather would never forget, and that his sons discuss at family barbecues and over Thanksgiving dinner that I will never forget either. There was a storm, a flood, and coffins washed out of graves. His sons tell me the story of how my grandfather picked up a woman, partially decayed, placed her back into her coffin. Before he closed it, he noticed the gouges on the underside of the lid. He noticed the pine splinters in the woman's fingernails. He imagined he saw a look on her face, a look of horror shining through the tendon and bone. Her story is part of my family story now, but probably not part of hers. Not that our family forgot her, though they might have. She died nearly 100 years ago, but I can't imagine that her family ever found out what really happened to her. So half-lives and additions, incomplete records for every party involved, a story by virtue of being told, refreshed and refreshed and refreshed. So many details of a life falling away until only certain polished images remain. And here I am, mid-40s, half a lifetime on the books, my version of a half-life. And it works this way for my own story too. Tales I've told are remembered, other things are forgotten. Parts of me exist in other people's memories, but not my own. But I remember things too, things that no longer exist. That Adam's Extract Factory, the original Matt's El Rancho, Les Amis, Skaggy's, houses where I imagined hobbits lived in the backyard. People, too, who were once in my life and who have not quite departed, people whose bodies I will never see again, both grandmothers, both grandfathers, and the families we were when we were together. My father, too. All of that memory bleeding through, and all of these things are mine, but also I am theirs. They took a part of me, too. And here's the thing about getting older, about being halfway through a lifespan. Half of me belongs to things that no longer exist. This is the tipping point. This is where I slide toward ghost. The world is shimmer, and all of the possibilities, and all of the people, my corporeal son next to the phantom of my grandmother. There's so much missing to the story. How did the game console come to us? Did my mother's friend say she needed to get rid of it for her son's sake? Did my own mother say that her daughters would like it? Does Jacob know I still think of him and his friend? What else does Jacob know about my family, the way I know things about his? When we run across each other at those Thanksgiving dinners, does he know about my stepfather, about the most painful and humiliating moments of my life? Does he know the contours of abuse from his time in the Yost Circle? Or does he believe the murder-suicide story was a lie, a cover-up? Does his mother know the things done to children? And if so, what responsibility does a person have to investigate the things you hear but never see? I know that I never finished the game. I'm not sure where everybody was in that moment I saw Eric Yost's name upon the screen, where my mother was, my stepfather, my sister, the dogs. What was cemented for me in that moment was a loneliness, a solitude that has never really been breached, not even in marriage or in motherhood. It was that boy, Eric Yost, the dead child, Jacob, my mom's friend's son, and me, all in that living room on Towee Drive in the Leisure Woods neighborhood in Buda, Texas at the end of the last century. My stepfather and the wake he left, even then fading, but never gone. My mother, how she failed us. My father in Indiana, selling and repossessing and reselling pianos off the back of a truck. A black screen on a cathode ray tube television, white capital letters. A feeling of something, the hope that I could be another person. But the answer to that question is no. Nobody knows what happened that night after Mr. Yost sent Jacob home. This is a story for somebody else and not us. The turf club, the sheriff and the murder weapon on the floor, and a family, a night, a canvas painted over, a figure, a ghost of pencil underneath the gesso. Thank you.